Gonzaga's newest conference mate is almost certainly going to be Texas State, and that might not be the worst news.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Monday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Well, folks, it's Monday, and it is a mailbag edition here, the Locked On Zags podcast. As a reminder for most of you, but for any new listeners, if you want to get involved in Mailbag Monday, you can reach out to me on social media, Andy Patton CBB. You can also find me on, you can find the Discord channel, Locked On Zags Discord. There's a link in the show notes. That is the easiest way to ask mailbag questions. There's a full section where you can just submit them there, and I will get them loaded up and into the show. You can also email me, andypatton013@gmail.com. We got lots to cover today. Transfer portal, or not really transfer portal as much, but we are talking about conference realignment. That's the transfer portal for schools. We're also talking a little bit about some baseball stuff, some other news around college athletics with the House settlement being settled and what that might mean for Gonzaga. Our first question here comes from Pilot Cam on Instagram, who says, it sure sounds like Texas State and UTSA are the next additions for the Pac-12. What are the pros and cons of these additions for Gonzaga specifically? Yeah, it's a great question. Good one to start with here as we kind of wait the finalization of this last school. At least one more school will be joining the Pac-12 in the next couple of weeks, a full member that includes football with the Zags. The Pac-12 needs this in order to be a conference that can compete in the college football playoffs. So we know that this is something that's going to happen. And the widespread expectation at this point is that Texas State will be that final addition. Whether it is made in conjunction with UT San Antonio or not kind of remains to be seen. It's possible they're both brought in at the same time. It's possible that Texas State is brought in as the lone addition, gets the Pac-12 to 8 full-time football members, 9 total schools, including Gonzaga, and then they might just sit back and wait and ultimately decide to add somebody like UT San Antonio at a later date. UTSA currently in the American Athletic Conference, the same conference that houses Memphis and Tulane and North Texas and a few other Rice and South Florida, other programs that have kind of been loosely connected to the Pac-12. So it's possible that the Pac-12 adds Texas State, sits on their hands for a bit, and then tries to pull UTSA and maybe even some of those other schools from the American Athletic Conference. So at this point, I would say Texas State more or less inevitable. UTSA, not as much. So I'll focus the question a little bit more on Texas State. The pros and cons. I think the cons are what most will focus on. Texas State's not a great basketball program. They haven't been. There's not really an indication that that's flipping around at this point. They have not made the NCAA tournament since 1997. They have primarily competed in a multitude of not very good conferences. They're briefly in the WAC. They're in the Sun Belt, the Southland. Like they've kind of been in a handful of different conferences. And I mean, even last year in the Sun Belt, which is not a great basketball conference, they went 9-9. Like this is just not a program that has a lot of basketball success, has a lot of reason to believe that there is imminent basketball success coming for the program. And then, of course, it's a massively long road trip for Gonzaga. They're not going to want to take. Gonzaga going all the way out to San Marcos, Texas, to play a team that finishes Ken Pom around 194 last year. They're frequently kind of in that late 100s, early 200. I mean, this is a program that's worse than LMU. I mean, they're maybe would finish 6th, 7th in the WCC. And so for Gonzaga, they don't like the road trips to LMU. They don't like the road trips to Pepperdine and San Diego. A road trip to San Marcos, Texas, to play a team that doesn't move the needle for them. That's not a good result. I think it's pretty clear that is a negative for Gonzaga, and they are likely not a huge champion or a huge proponent of Texas State at this point. There are some pros, however. Texas State is a sleeping giant. And that is it's a risk. I think a lot of people think, you can call any program a sleeping giant. And yeah, to some extent, but it's in a big geographic area. And I think similar but different to UTSA, the sense that UTSA is in San Antonio, but does not have a large kind of chunk of that media market. Like there's tons, hundreds of thousands of people in San Antonio. Most of them don't care about UTSA. Whereas San Marcos, smaller market, but there is more of a fan base. There's like Texas State has a built-in fan base. They have boosters, they have backers, they have people interested in this program. And that is why I think that it could be more of a sleeping giant than perhaps some other programs might be. And Texas State joining the Pac-12, they're a good baseball program. Their football is kind of up and coming. If they play well in football and they add to the conference that way, yes, it's still no good if they're a bad basketball team and they're dragging down the conference. But if they're a positive in football, that's good for the Pac-12 at large. That in turn could raise them more money, the conference more money, which in turn is good for Gonzaga. So I think there's still some positives there. And then there's the idea, the argument that a lot of folks have more on the football side of like, we want to be able to get into Texas from a recruiting perspective. And I think that this benefits Gonzaga as well, not on the football side, obviously, but for Gonzaga, like they recruit in Texas. We know that. Drew Timmy's from Texas. The recent 2025 incoming player, Parker Jefferson, is also from Texas. And I mean, Dimitri Goodson's from Texas. And Gonzaga went out and played Rice, a decade or so ago. And that's kind of how they ended up getting Jeremy Jones. Like this is like they have used road trips to states to recruit in the past. And so getting into Texas and getting into the San Antonio, San Marcos area is not a bad thing for Gonzaga at all. So is it a good thing? Like, would it be my top choice? Absolutely not. Among the options right now, if we don't think Memphis and Tulane are options for the next couple of weeks and are maybe more likely to be options a year or so from now, I'm fine with Texas State. I like it as a better option than maybe some of the other not as appealing options. Sac State's been talked about. That's not a good option. I'm not a big New Mexico State fan. Louisiana, maybe there's some intrigue there, but like I don't think Texas State is as bad of an addition as maybe some folks might think that it is. But it's certainly not moving the needle in a positive direction from a men's basketball perspective. Next question here comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, there are several groups that are exceedingly certain the Pac-12 is going to add St. Mary's. I do not understand why that is. Can you explain? Why would the Pac-12 even consider a school with a tiny gym like what St. Mary's has? Even Texas State has a 7,000-seat arena for basketball games. I get why St. Mary's is begging the Pac-12 to add them because the loss of Gonzaga is going to be devastating to the WCC. If the Pac-12 wants to strengthen its basketball footing, it seems like they would be better off adding New Mexico State, which also has a football team and has basketball facilities that are twice as large as St. Mary's. Although New Mexico State in the last couple of years has not been good, St. Mary's basketball success still only goes back about 16 years. And for all of St. Mary's regular season success, they still have 6 NCAA tournament wins and has only gotten to the Sweet 16 once. Okay, a lot to get to here. First of all, way too hung up on arena size. I cannot fathom, like Texas State's not a better addition than Gonzaga, but they have a bigger basketball arena. Like that's just too big of a hang up. Yes, St. Mary's basketball arena is small. Yes, that is a negative for St. Mary's, but it is not the be all end all for the Gales. The idea that they've only had recent basketball success, which goes back 16 years, feels like a weird shot at St. Mary's when Gonzaga only has recent basketball success that only goes back a decade longer than that. Like comparatively, 16 years to 25 years is just not that big of a difference. So if your huge negatives for St. Mary's are small arena, only have recent basketball success, and you're counting 16 years as recent, it feels like we got to flip the mirror around a little bit here. And yes, Gonzaga's success in basketball is significantly more than St. Mary's success, far more NCAA tournament success, far more brand awareness. I'm not saying they're the same. I'm just saying the arguments being used here dramatically against St. Mary's feel like arguments that could be pretty easily used against Gonzaga as well. The idea that New Mexico State's a better addition than St. Mary's is honestly laughably bad to me. Like, yes, New Mexico State has football, but the Pac-12 is not so desperate that they're just going to add a very bad football program. They don't want to add bad football programs. If they wanted to add bad football programs, they'd have merged with the Mountain West. But they wanted the good programs out of the Mountain West, and then they weren't able to do some of the other moves that they wanted to do. I think that's fairly clear. But the idea that New Mexico State's a better addition than St. Mary's is just incorrect. It's just incorrect to say, oh, they've had more sustainable or more success in their history. Like, I don't care what they did 20 years ago. I know they were good like 10-ish years ago, and they had Pascal Siakam and Teddy Allen and some other good players, but that coach is over at Mississippi State now. And since then, they have not been good. And I know that's an argument that would be used against St. Mary's is like, oh, well, once Randy Bennett leaves, St. Mary's is not going to be good. And yet when New Mexico State loses their coach and then brings in a new coach who gets fired partway through the year and the program gets shut down because of ridiculous amount of hazing allegations, we're saying, well, New Mexico State's a better addition because they had success previously. That doesn't make sense. Those two arguments are like 10 years from now, if Randy Bennett's been gone for 6 years and St. Mary's has been bad for 4 years, nobody's going to say, oh, well, St. Mary's is a better addition because they used to be good. That doesn't make any sense. And so it doesn't make sense to credit New Mexico State for having success under a previous head coach while saying St. Mary's, while not counting St. Mary's as current success because, oh, that might change when they switch coaches. That argument falls flat. Yes, St. Mary's does not have very good resources. Yes, St. Mary's is a small school that there is a risk in taking them on because the facilities are not great and because they don't have football. And if the basketball program takes a dip, then they're kind of a program that maybe isn't doing a lot for the Pac-12. All that's true. And there are reasons to be against the St. Mary's in the Pac-12. But the idea that they're comparable to New Mexico State is wrong. I will say that again. And two, I think it's not like St. Mary's is going to get a huge payout. They're going to get a much smaller cut. The Pac-12 would rather add a football program they feel like is more in tune with success than New Mexico State, because New Mexico State is a bad football program. And they would rather add a football program they like that they think is a sleeping giant like Texas State, and then add a basketball program that brings immediate value to the conference, which St. Mary's does. St. Mary's, Gonzaga, San Diego State, Boise State, Colorado State, Utah State is a really good basketball conference. Does St. Mary's value, is it possible that it doesn't last as long if Coach Bennett moves on or retires? Yeah, sure. That's true of almost any. That's true of Gonzaga. We have to be honest. Gonzaga is more set up sustainably long-term because they have more resources poured into athletics and things like that. But I just don't think the arguments against St. Mary's hold as much value. And it's not like, again, they're not going to get, if Gonzaga is getting $10 million from the Pac-12, St. Mary's is not getting $10 million from the Pac-12. They're getting way, way, way less than that. So getting them on a cheap deal to add an instant rivalry that already exists, to add a program that has had some sustainable TV success, not a huge amount, but enough that it's worth being added to this conference, I think all makes sense. And I don't think that the small arena is nearly enough of an argument. And the fact that they've only been good in basketball for the last 15 years, which is just not an argument that I think makes a lot of sense against St. Mary's at this point. Well, folks, contracts, are they the next big step in college athletics? And if so, what might that mean for Gonzaga? We're going to address that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, there is nothing like the NBA Finals. The intensity, the buzzer beaters, the fans losing their minds. We've seen it all. And it is the kind of atmosphere that if you can, you got to experience it live. And boy, has this year's matchup delivered in a big way. And if you want in, Game Time makes it fast and easy to get seats, even for the biggest playoff games. Prices on the app, they actually go down the closer you get to tip-off. And with killer last-minute deals, panoramic seat views, and no surprise fees at checkout, Game Time is a total game changer. I love that I can see the exact view from my seat before I buy tickets, and there's no surprises. And with Game Time's guarantee, you also know that you are getting the best deal. If you find a better price in the same row and section, they will credit you 110% of the difference. Folks, Game 5 tonight, Oklahoma City versus the Indiana Pacers. The series tied 2-2. Chet Holmgren, Andrew Nembhard. There is so much to love. And if you are anywhere near the Oklahoma City area, folks, you can get into the door for under $400. That is an incredible deal for the 5th game of the NBA Finals. And that includes fees. So, folks, take the guesswork out of buying those tickets by using Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still going through Mailbag Monday here on the show as we get into another week here in the middle of the summer on the Locked On Zags podcast. This next question comes from Emily via Gmail. Emily says, I've heard people talking about contracts being necessary for the NIL era of college basketball, contracts for how long an athlete would stay, but also if a student athlete from a mid-major transferred to a power conference, then the power conference would have to buy out the contract, allowing the smaller schools to get paid for developing players so they don't do all the work without reaping any of the reward. I was wondering what you thought about that idea. If the House settlement moves schools towards this at all, what your ideal NIL system might look like. Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think this is a compelling conversation about the future of college athletics, and I think a conversation that we will expand upon probably multiple times, if not in this offseason, certainly in future off seasons as we kind of move more and more towards this. My immediate thoughts are this. I think contracts are going to be a part of college athletics, but I don't think it is all that imminent. I think we are still a ways away, in part because, as we have seen, things kind of don't go all that fast. And I know it seems counterintuitive of like the NIL era and the transfer portal and all, like the amount of changes in the last half decade has been significant. I will not lie about that. But something this significant, I think, is going to take a lot of time. Like the amount of time it took when we discussed NIL and we discussed student athletes getting paid before it actually happened was huge. I don't think it's going to be this long, but I think if you told me we had contracts 10 years from now, I would believe you. But if you told me we had contracts 5 years from now, I'd be a little surprised. That's a guess, a gut instinct based on just kind of vibes at this point, and obviously could change very dramatically. But I think the next step is more of collective bargaining. You'll have a governing body representing student athletes that'll interact with the NCAA, that'll interact with conference commissioners, that'll interact with the CSC, the new College Sports Commission, and kind of figure out things that they want to collectively bargain. And I think some of the things that could get kind of tightened up and fixed in this space would be transfer portal windows, would be multi-time transfers. What do we want to do about that? Schools obviously have different opinions than players. How can we bargain on this? How can we come to a ruling on this? Eligibility waivers, which seem to be inconsistent from the NCAA. Can we get some more clarity on that? International signings. I suspect that student athletes, to some degree, probably want to have thoughts about 22-year-olds coming over and becoming true freshmen at the collegiate level. So like, I think collective bargaining on some of those things is the next step. And I think employment directly with student athletes being directly employed by the schools and paid publicly with contracts, I think that is a bit farther down the road. But to answer the second part of the question about my ideal system, it's that. I think publicly known contracts for student athletes is the way to go. We have crossed the threshold where college athletics is no longer just mirroring professional sports or like professional sports or a mini-me. It is professional sports. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I know some people are like, oh, the sport that I love is gone. Like, I get it. It's different. Change is hard. This is a very significant change. But I think that this is a good thing for student athletes. But I do think that we need, hey, so-and-so signed a 1-year deal. And then that way the fan base is like, okay, this guy's a true freshman, but he's only signed a 1-year deal. So he'll be a free agent at the end of the year. And then that way, maybe you don't feel as like the rug got pulled out of you when that player transfers. But if a player signs a 3-year contract with you, and then they want to leave early, there's some consequence. And I'm not saying they get punished or like, consequence doesn't necessarily mean like a super negative thing, but there's some rule in place that says, okay, you have to buy back part of your contract or pay back a certain thing, or the school that poaches you has to pay a fee. Like, I think that those things are good. I think about the University of Portland where I used to work. If they bring in a freshman and Coach Leggins is recruiting them and says, and the kid's like, well, I really want to go to a bigger school, blah, blah, blah. And Legg says, hey, I can't pay you as much as Oregon, but I can sign you to a 1-year deal. I can pay you this amount of money. You're going to start, you're going to play big minutes. And if you want to leave after this 1 year, you can do that. And then, he then transfers to Oregon. Oregon pays Portland some money. They use that money to bring in more players. That evens the playing field in a lot of ways. I don't think the big schools are going to love that necessarily. I don't think they want to pay smaller schools money, but I think that there's some value in that. And I think there is a lot that, it's going to be tough to iron it all out. And that's why I think it's going to take a long time. But I think ultimately that is what it needs to look like, because right now I think it's just too messy. And even with the new rules, I think having a College Sports Commission, which is in charge of monitoring third-party NIL deals, I think that's a good thing, because I don't think those should go away either. Like, if a player wants to sign a 1-year, $500,000 contract to play at Gonzaga, but then they also, they have, big goofy hair like so many Gonzaga players do, and there's a hair salon in Spokane that wants to sign them to an NIL deal and like have them do a couple commercials for them, they should be able to do that. Again, pro athletes can do that. College athletes should be able to do that. I do think there needs to be a governing body watching these, because it'd be very easy to funnel money through these third-party NIL deals and say, well, we'll sign you to a $500,000 contract publicly, but we'll give you $2 million on the side. And those are the kind of things that you want to avoid, because that's been what's plaguing college athletics for a really long time. So that's a trickier one. I don't have all the answers there, other than I think a third-party group like the College Sports Commission should be in charge of monitoring those things. But the actual logistics of that, I think, is much more challenging than maybe we realize. There's going to be flooded with literally thousands and thousands of NIL requests and parsing out which one of these are legitimate, which one of these need to be investigated more. I mean, it's a ludicrously difficult job, but I do think ultimately something like that needs to exist in order for this to work functionally. And again, I think we're a ways away from a lot of this stuff, but I do think that is the direction we are going in college athletics. Next question here comes from Jim on Facebook. Jim says, do you see the House settlement eventually ending scholarships altogether? No, not really. Like I paired these questions together because it kind of goes nicely with that question ahead of there. I think eventually student athletes will be employees. I think that has to be the eventual reality. Again, I think it's going to take longer than it probably should, if we're being honest. But I think ultimately that's what it needs to be. Student athletes, you agree to go to a school, you sign your NLI, your national letter of intent, and you sign your NIL deal. You sign NLI and NIL. That's going to be confusing for people working in administration. Regardless, you sign your deals, you commit to the school, and then you become an employee and you sign an employee contract. And that's where, like, hey, here's your pay. Here's, what is expected of you. You show up to practice, you do this, you do that, whatever. And then I think they're still going to get their scholarships, though, because they're still going to be students at the school. And like, there are student employees all over the place. Like, many of my friends were student employees at Gonzaga, and like they, their scholarships were still, it wasn't impacted by that. Some of them did work study, and I know that that's a part of it. But like, I think ultimately, if you're paying student athletes and you're not putting them on scholarship, it's kind of silly. Like, you're paying them, but then they're also paying the school. Like, it just doesn't really make sense. To me, it makes the most sense to have them all still be on scholarship, just like they are for football and men's, women's basketball. All those student athletes have full ride scholarships. I think you keep doing that, and then you get the NIL on top of that. And maybe in other sports, we'll see if it changes in some meaningful way. But I don't think that scholarships are really going to change all that much. I think I don't think there's any reason for that to really be something that changes in this new era. Final question in the segment comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, if we set the over-under at 2 for the number of top-level recruits from the 2026 class that Gonzaga gets commitments for, would you, knowing what you know now, would you take the over or under? I want to be clear on one thing. I don't really know a whole lot. I don't mean that in like a negative way. I just mean like, I don't have inside information that I'm not revealing to all of you. So if you've heard me say it, that's what I know. If you haven't heard me say it, I don't really know a whole lot about it. I don't pretend to be an insider. I am somebody who reacts to news. So I want to always clear that up of like, I'm not sitting on secret information that I'm not revealing. I promise you, if I know something, you're going to know it as soon as I flip this mic on after that. I would say probably under. Maybe that's just being a little bit pessimistic, which is not typically my MO. But there's a lot. Gonzaga's shooting for the moon in the 2026 class. They have their eyes on the number 1 overall player in the class, in Tyron Stokes, number 10 overall player, Nikenna Elozi, and then a couple top 25 guys, Tony Bryant, Sam Funches, right outside the top 25. Like, they have their eye on some big fish, but all those schools are being pursued by big names. Every single one of those programs is being pursued by like Kentucky and Arkansas and Kansas and Duke, in some cases, North Carolina. Like, it's a tough sledding. I said this on a previous show, and so for those of you who want to check it out, I think it was late last week, we talked about how Gonzaga's pursuit of 2026 recruits is interesting in the sense that they are in a position right now, especially when the Pac-12 media deal comes out, where they can be a bit more comfortable committing large sums of money to 2026 players, whereas SEC and Big Ten schools, which up until the House settlement were comfortable throwing around huge sums of money because they were not limited at all, they are now going to be limited by the $20.5 million limit that all athletics programs have to directly pay student athletes, and the fact that those programs are going to be committing probably 75% of that money to their football program, whereas Gonzaga may not have $20.5 million, but they're going to commit a much higher percentage of their money to men's basketball. So right now, Gonzaga can go to Tyron Stokes or Tony Bryant or Sam Funches and say, hey, you want $750K? I'm just making up numbers here, but you want $750K? Boom, we can give you that. Whereas Kentucky might say, hey, we're not sure right now. Like, maybe we can promise you $300K and we can probably get you the other $450K in some back channel NIL deals, but they can't promise that. They can't. They don't know if the College Sports Commission is going to shut down any of their kind of ideas on that right now. So that puts Gonzaga in a spot where they may, if Mark Few is willing to, throw out big amounts of money and kind of woo these guys from these SEC schools that might be a little hesitant to commit that kind of cash right now, I do think Gonzaga is in an advantageous spot in the 2026 recruiting class because of that. And I think if they're throwing that around, I could absolutely see them making a push where they land a guard and a big, like they land a Losey and Funches, which would be a massive transfer portal class addition, or a massive recruiting class for Gonzaga in 2026. So I wouldn't be surprised if they land more than two, but if I had to guess right now, I'd probably say it's more likely one, just because we haven't seen Gonzaga land like multiple 4 or 5 star guys in the class before. So I think it's a little risky to assume that will happen in this case. But again, their situation is somewhat unique and advantageous for them right now. Final segment of the show. There's no shortage of international talent flocking to college basketball right now, but will that continue if there's some concerns about student visas in our country right now? We're going to discuss that coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Closing out the show with a couple more mailbag questions here. This next one comes from Emily via Gmail, second of the show for Emily. She says, I've heard a little talk about international student visas being revoked and or much harder to come by with new policies from this administration. Have you heard anything about how this might impact college basketball players? No, I haven't. There's not a lot of clarity right now. It doesn't seem to be impacting players coming over this offseason. The big storyline around this, for those who maybe missed this, was Kaman Malawach, the starting center for Duke this past year, was on a student visa from South Sudan. And then there was a policy change that basically revoked all student visas for people from South Sudan in light of some immigration issues. I won't get all the way into it. Certainly not going to get into the political side of things on this, but it was concerning for Malawach. Like, is he going to be able to stay in the States? I think it's unfortunate that the timing happened hours before Duke took on Houston, and Malawach then had a very bad game against Houston, and it impacted his draft stock and certainly impacted Duke's ability to win the game, as they did not. And I think it was just really, really tremendously bad timing for poor Kaman, who didn't deserve any of this to happen to him. And now it's like, you know, if you read a mock draft and you see Kaman Malawach mocked to Toronto, that's part of the reason why, is because there's concern that he might not be able to stay in the States. I think an NBA team would probably be able to find a way to make it work, but it's a unique situation. I think the majority, since that happened, this offseason has seen a massive influx of international players coming to the United States and committing to college basketball programs. We still await the confirmation of Mario Saint-Superi committing to Gonzaga from Spain, but Nico Avdilas is likely going to go to Virginia Tech. We've seen Luka Bogovac just went to North Carolina. I know Ohio State just landed a big. I know Arkansas just landed a big from the international ranks. Illinois has a couple of international guys. Like, there have been a ton of them. Most of those guys are coming from countries where I just don't think they're that concerned. Spain, Germany, Greece. You know, I think it's the South Sudans and it's some of the other countries that maybe don't have as good of a relationship with the United States right now, where maybe you see some changes. Ultimately, I don't think it'll be a dramatic change. Maybe a handful of players will get spooked out of it, but I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, but it is certainly something we're keeping an eye on. One of many changes or adjustments happening in college athletics right now. Final 2 questions of the show both come from Jeff. Jeff says, I know Oregon State baseball is technically playing independent this year, but what do you think Oregon State winning a national title would do for the new Pac-12? Also, how exciting is it going to be to see Oregon State come to Spokane to play baseball rather than just seeing Gonzaga go play at OSU year over year? Hey, man, Gonzaga doesn't just play Oregon State in Corvallis. They also play Oregon State in Hillsboro, which is pretty cool for me as I live 10 minutes away from the arena where they play. But yes, obviously Gonzaga does not host Oregon State in Spokane, and yes, it will be very cool to have a team of that caliber coming to Spokane and playing baseball. That's a cool thing for the conference, for the school as well. Oregon State, for what it's worth, Jeff had also included in this email like a little bit about how Oregon State was doing and how he hoped they would beat Coastal Carolina on Sunday when he sent the email. They did not, unfortunately, beat Coastal Carolina on Sunday. They're not eliminated. They are playing Louisville on Tuesday. Need to win that game to stay alive. If they win that game, they'll get another crack at Coastal Carolina and continue to advance from there. But yeah, it's great. You know, I think you look at the Pac-12 right now and you have what appears to be a pretty consistently dominant football program in Boise State, a consistently dominant basketball program in Gonzaga, and then a consistently dominant baseball program in Oregon State. And I think those are all good things for the conference to have some notoriety, some recognition nationally. Oregon State has been a strong baseball program for 2 decades now. They are consistently very, very good. Baseball doesn't move the needle for a conference all that much, so it's not that big of a deal, but it doesn't hurt. it doesn't hurt. I'm more worried about the long-term viability of Oregon State's baseball program, because this is not a conference that cares all that much about baseball. I mean, some of these Mountain West schools don't even have baseball. They don't intend to start baseball. Again, going back previously, Texas State is a decent baseball program, so that would be a good addition for that sport. St. Mary's also has had some baseball success, so that would be a good addition in that regard as well. But right now, the baseball in this conference is not great. And I think I would worry that Oregon State might not be able to stay competitive in the transfer portal NIL era in a conference that isn't as good, but we will see if they're able to kind of buck that trend and stay successful despite not being in a baseball conference that will be as good as the previous Pac-12 was. Final question of the show, again from Jeff. He says, can we get a shout out for Gonzaga track and field senior Rosina Machu, who just finished 7th in the 10,000 meters at the 2025 Track and Field National Championship Finals and is now a track and field All-American for the 3rd year in a row? Yes, we can. It's been great to see Gonzaga's track and field program continue to be to uptick. I think the WCC has been long dominant by Portland on the track and field side, but it's been great to see Gonzaga having some success in that sport. And obviously, anybody who's a 3-time All-American is just obviously tremendously successful. So a huge shout out to Rosina for going out, for knocking it out. 10,000 meters. That's fantastic. Always fun to see Gonzaga's other sports succeeding. We saw this with soccer having a big uptick after kind of being more middling. At least when I was in school, they weren't a great program. And so it's great to see them kind of picking it up and turning it around. Volleyball just brought in a new coaching staff. JT Winger comes in, and I'm excited to see what that program can do under some new leadership coming over from Stephen F. Austin. So it's always cool to see these programs kind of succeeding. And again, the move to the Pac-12, I think it will help in a lot of ways for many of these sports, just being in a conference where I think there's going to be a little bit more competition in a lot of ways. So I think this will be a really good thing for the entirety of the university, not just the basketball side of things, which is what we focus on primarily, but certainly there's some benefits outside of that as well. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Again, a special shout out to those everyday listeners. I appreciate you. We'll be back later this week, more this week, continuing our NBA draft profiles. We've already done ones on Ryan Nembhard and Caleb Battle. Got 2 more on Ben Gregg and Nolan Hickman. We'll keep you up to date on any transfer portal updates, recruiting updates, more draft stuff. Obviously, conference realignment stuff, as we're going to get information about the new media deal for the Pac-12. We're going to get confirmation about their new additions in the conference. So we'll have plenty of updates on that as well. Thanks again, folks, for listening. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And of course, as always, go Zags.